this time from the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton University. Joining me now is Freeman Dyson. Mr. Dyson, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Man-made climate change. Where are we at from your perspective? Is it incontrovertible science, or are we being led down a path that you are suspicious of?
Well, first of all, there is man-made climate change. I mean, it's a question how much and is it good or bad? And there are all sorts of questions. The fact that it exists is not a question. Certainly there is some effect of humans on climate, and we have to try to find out what it is. All I would say is, first of all, we don't understand the details. It's probably much less than is generally claimed. And the most important thing is that there are huge non-climate effects of carbon dioxide which are overwhelmingly favorable, which are not taken into account. To me, that's the main issue, that the Earth is actually growing greener. This has been actually measured from satellites. The whole Earth is growing greener as a result of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it's increasing agricultural yields, it's increasing the forests, it's increasing all kinds of growth in the biological world. And that's more important and more certain than the effects on climate.
Well, this is where you started your research, isn't it? In the effects of CO2 on vegetation.
Yes.
And over the years, what have you found?
Well, it's increasing just more or less as we expected. I started working on this 37 years ago, and at the time when we thought the effects were maybe about 10%, and now it's probably more like 25% after 35 years. It's essentially what we expected. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has gone up by 40% in that time or something like that.
Yeah, up to about 400 parts per million at the moment. Just shy of that, I think.
Yes, about half of that is gone into raising vegetation. So vegetation has increased on the average by around 20%. And that's observed. And of course it's extremely important. It actually is enormously beneficial both to food production and also to the biodiversity, preservation of species and everything else that's good. So the remarkable thing is that these effects, which have nothing to do with climate, effects of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, are so much easier to measure than the effects on climate, and so much more certain.
Well, I know that in a greenhouse where there is, industrial growing of plants for food production, the carbon dioxide parts per million is up around 1,200 parts per million. We know that it works in an actual greenhouse, but there was a considerable amount of concern as to whether or not that would actually translate into the atmosphere globally. And you're saying that the evidence is in that the benefit exists in the world at large as well.
Yes, on the average. I mean, of course, it's not true everywhere. And you can find cases where it doesn't work and cases where it does work. If you look at the details, it depends on what other nutrients are available. Of course, if the growth of plants is limited by not having enough nitrogen, then giving it more carbon won't help. And so most of the time there is enough nitrogen, and giving it more carbon does help. So it's understandable that the effects vary from place to place.
You're also on record as saying that we will be able to genetically re-engineer trees to help absorb any excess amount of carbon that's in the environment. And I was reading recently about precision genetic engineering, so that we can splice right into the gene and say, this is the particular component. Do you see this being like an alternative if we get to the point where we go, the level of CO2 in the atmosphere is something that we're uncomfortable with?
Yes, but that's in the very long run. And so I think people have to understand there are some things which are true right now other things which will be true in 100 years and other things which will be true in 500 years, and that makes a big difference. So what you're talking about, so genetic engineering of the plants all over the earth, I would say it probably at least 100 years from now. It certainly will be important in the long run, but it's a very long run. So one shouldn't think of that as something we're going to be doing in the next 10 years.
So if I come back to the question of CO2 in the atmosphere, we've seen about a 40% increase, I believe, over the last 130 some odd years of measurement. Is that correct?
That's accurate, yes.
But we haven't seen a 40% increase in temperature. So the rise of CO2 doesn't necessarily correlate to temperature change. Do you understand why all of a sudden then there is such concern about CO2 increases and what it's going to do to global temperatures?
Well, I don't try to impute motives to people. I mean, I disagree with people very strongly, but I don't say that they're evil because they disagree with me. So I'm not talking about, I think I don't want to analyze other people's motives. There certainly is an enormous religion in which there are lots of true believers who think that climate change is evil and that we're going to run into big catastrophes if we don't do something drastic. And that's a sort of a belief system which exists. I don't understand it, and I don't pretend to understand their motives.
But so much of that belief is predicated upon models that are represented, computer models that take data from weather stations around the world, and they say that this modeling demonstrates that this projection is going to work.
This, of course, I have always been fighting against, the idea that the models actually are good predictors. And my friend Yuichiro Minabe, he's a Japanese climate expert who lives here in Princeton, and he was actually the first person who ever did climate models with increased carbon dioxide just to see what it would do. And he found the warming, and it was less than is now fashionable, but anyway, there was some warming.
Is this the modeling that goes back to the late 60s?
Yes.
Yes, okay, I was reading about that.
So anyway, Manabe always said, and still he says, that these climate models are excellent tools for understanding climate, but they're very bad tools for predicting climate. And the reason is simple, that they are models which have only a few of the factors in them that may be important. So you can vary one thing at a time, so you can it helps to understand if you vary one thing at a time and see what happens, in particular carbon dioxide. But there's a whole lot of things they leave out. And that's why they're no good for prediction. That the real world is far more complicated than the models.
And that is the challenge, isn't it?
Well, I don't say it's a challenge. I don't think any of these models can ever be really predictive.
Because climate is too complex?
Yes.
And there's too many factors at work?
Yes, and you just cannot model everything. It's way, way out of sight.
I have interviewed other scientists about climate, and I've asked them what the effect of the sun is. And they said, well, the sun has a convenient excuse. Its temperature hasn't changed. Is that true?
It's true the sun's temperature doesn't change, but its activity does change. Its activity, meaning sunspots and magnetic storms, they changed with the 11-year cycle very strongly. And we see an effect on climate. There's a young man here, in fact, called Nir Shaviv, an Israeli, who has actually studied this. He actually finds a very direct effect of this solar cycle, the sunspot cycle, on the climate. So it is important. It has nothing to do with the temperature of the sun.
It has more to do with the radiation that makes its way into the Earth's atmosphere.
Yes. It's mostly the cosmic rays, the high energy radiation. It doesn't have anything to do with the actual temperature of the sun.
And it's that ability of that energy to be able to penetrate Earth's atmosphere and warm the atmosphere that we live in.
Well, it's a complicated situation. I mean, that Shaviv has studied the evidence, and the evidence is clear that this activity of the sun is having an effect. And of course, there was a big additional piece of evidence, which was the Little Ice Age, which happened in the 17th century, which also coincided with the time when the sun went to sleep for about 70 years. There was a thing called the Maunder minimum, when the sunspots just didn't happen. And at the same time, there was a very cold climate in Europe. So that's fairly strong evidence of correlation. But there's much more direct evidence now from modern observations, so that the correlation is certainly there. Exactly how the activity of the sun influences the climate is not completely clear. It has something to do with cosmic rays, but it's not direct heating of the atmosphere. It's probably an effect on clouds, but we don't know for sure.